Now, the next three speakers, in fact, do actually have 15 minutes. Tony Merriman speaking next on the simple topic of the genetics of diabetes and obesity. Thanks very much, Tony.
Thank you very much, and I always enjoy coming to Auckland. As a Dunedin person, it's nice to sit outside at night and have a beer. Alex, I love rugby. I love cricket, but you never apologised for the underarm. Was that included?
I wasn't informed.
Oh. I remember it, but I mean, I'm a Highlander fan. I love rugby, and I think rugby's a great metaphor for life, but instead I've got ballet. So I'm going to today try and give a Gene 101 course and fit the relative contributions, which are both very important, of environmental exposures, genetic exposures, and the interaction between the two, into understanding the causes and drivers of diabesity. So this is a task for you lot. One of those children is my daughter, roughly 5 years old, 5 or 6, a group of 6 girls growing up in Dunedin in the early 2000s. So we'll start from the, you get one vote. Start from the left and just put your hand up if you think the one on the left is my daughter. Oh. What about the one second left with number 2? Okay. Third left? Yep. One third right? Least. No, you've seen this before, you're just taking the mickey. Second right, and the one on the right. Okay, so you are geneticists at heart. So you collectively picked number 1 and 4. I think they're both the cutest ones, but they're the 2 shortest ones, right? So it's illustrating that you guys know, judging me, right? And anyone who knows my wife will make a better informed decision. But it illustrates the contribution of inherited genetic variants in a phenotype called height. And what we know is that 80% of the reason why these children vary in height is due to inherited genetic variants from their parents. 20% due to environment and other unknown factors. And what I'm going to make the point is that's not to underestimate the role of the environment, because if we could think about these children living, say, 200 years ago in the East End of London, they'd all be shorter, wouldn't they? And that's because of the different environment they were living in. So what we get a picture of is that we have genetic variants that are important in understanding the reasons why some kids are tall, some kids are short, are important, but environment modulates the average, okay? Genetics sort of helping us understand who gets diabetes, who doesn't, but the environment is really important in modulating the average prevalence. Now, we know that height is pretty genetic, 80% of variance in height explained by genetics generally, whereas diabetes and obesity is less genetic, and depending on the studies, and you work it out by comparing rates between, or concordance between monozygotic and dizygotic twin pairs generally, about 40 to 60% genetic, but still important. And we know that the genes in height, it is many, many genes, and they have weak effect. So there's no single, aside from monogenic causes of, say, obesity, diabetes, and gigantism, single genes are certainly the rare exception. She's now 18 and charging around Auckland as we speak, up at Justin Bieber concert in a car that a hire company rented to an 18-year-old, and I'm kind of worried. So we know that it's out near the airport. On the right, the shortest one. Sorry, I forgot to mention that. But you now know where you can send your teenage girls to hire a car. We know there's 20,000 genes in the genome spread throughout your chromosomes, and just to sort of illustrate importance of genetics, there's this X and Y here, and that's the difference between men and women, right? Piece of DNA, large piece of DNA, but that is the difference. And what we do know is that DNA consists of, in terms of explaining the variation with us, if you examine the entire world's population, you will find hundreds of millions of specific genetic variants that some of them contribute to the differences between us. The genome is 3,500 million base pairs. And here's an example of base pairs. A cytosine to a thymine at a particular point in the DNA helix. And I learnt my lesson about buying my wife DNA type things. I bought her a 23andMe test and it did not go down well. But anyway, here's the landscape, if you like, of contribution of genetic variants to diabetes and obesity and any common phenotype, where you have here's the prevalence of alleles of causal genetic variants in the population, and here's their effect. And it's really a spectrum from the rare genetic variants with strong effect down to the common genetic variants of weak effect, and common up to 50%. And these are the ones that drive the largest proportion of explaining the variability between people and phenotype. It's these variants that are easiest to study because they're common, they give you greater power because the genetic variants have weak effect. You need large numbers of people to get statistically significant associations, and because they're common, it helps you on the power. So the so-called genome-wide association studies have focused in this area here, but it's clear that there will be low frequency variants with intermediate effect that are actually biologically more informative and perhaps clinically more translatable, and in our gout research we're certainly seeing that these are present. But anyway, the genome-wide association studies, has been many done over the past in sample sets of hundreds of thousands of people that have told us a lot about the inherited and genetic causes of diabetes. And really, one thing we can see, the FTO gene, it kind of formally proves, if you like, that obesity is causal of type 2 diabetes, but various pathways, muscle dysfunction, adipose, liver, fat distribution, and islet insulin secretion defects. There's well over 100 genes implicated or loci implicated in type 2 diabetes. Going to obesity, it's actually been really informative to look at and understand causes of monogenic obesity, and in terms of trying to educate people that genetics is important. It's these rare forms of obesity are actually quite useful. So this was one of the first studies published way back in the early 1990s from a Pakistani family, a mutation in the leptin gene, where this child, 3 years of age, I think here, didn't produce any leptin, and leptin is a hormone that's important in appetite. Okay. You need it to suppress appetite. And by leptin replacement therapy, this is the same child at 9 years of age. Quite a dramatic, really extreme example of in this case, the medicalisation of obesity. And there's been a couple of examples in popular press recently, particularly this one a couple of years ago. This big Bonnie baby who's 8 months old, 20 kilograms in Colombia, and mum gave him to a charity to help sort out what his problem was. And the crucial thing here is his son's weight had he was born with an anxiety, so when he cried, I fed him. And it's quite possible that this would be the phenotype of a child with a mutation in the leptin gene, where the child is never full, never feels full, always hungry, because that's the phenotype of that Pakistani boy as well. And there was a lot of comment about this, largely negative and stigmatising obesity, stigmatising mum for not being a good mum, whereas perhaps we could think about the possibility that this child has a strong genetic cause of being obese. Look at that and try and understand it a bit better. And along the same lines, here's China's fattest boy. He's 5 or 6 years old now, and doctors say his obesity is down to bad eating habits. And this is 2015, 2016. We know about the genetic causes of monogenic obesity for over 2 decades, why are the doctors not thinking about genetics being a cause here as well, and perhaps going in and screening the leptin gene, the leptin receptor gene, and some other genes? So common obesity really is the biggest impact in our populations. And again, the same genome-wide association studies have emphasised the importance of brain regulation of appetite as the most important pathway, the strongest genetic effects in regulating the inherited contribution to obesity. So it seems to be that there's biology here with people who have a genetic background, that part of it is that they would never feel full enough. Okay, so in a food replete environment, it's very easy to keep eating till you feel full, eating too much. There's also other fat cell size, energy metabolism, but really what we're knowing now, and genetics has contributed to this understanding, is the integration between organs in the body, the fat cells, the gut, and very recent paper, bone as well, where you have these hormones that are secreted that respond to the body's energy, perceived energy levels, feed back to the hypothalamus and control eating behaviour. And I just like to point out the first author here, Giles Yeo, is going to be in Wellington. So some of you may have seen this on the TV earlier. So he's at a Maurice Wilkins Centre sponsored symposium at the Royal Society in Wellington next month, so do come along. And he's also giving a talk in Dunedin as well the day before. So environment, because environment is critical, and we all completely agree on that. And as I said before, environment increases the penetrance of a population pool of risk variants. Okay, that's pretty clear. But these risk variants are a product of millions of years of hominoid and human evolution, and certainly the selection for people with a stronger drive to eat would have been important in these millions of years. And eating, and I think Dave will talk about this later, eating is autonomous. Keeping your body's perceived energy levels up, brain controlled, is an autonomous thing, and it's an important drive selected for, and I'd put it in the same basket as the sex drive. Okay, two important selective traits that have been selected for over many millions of years. I just want to point out that unpredictable interactions will exist, and here's an example from a particular gene in gout. Gout's a major research area, and here's a cohort of Maori and Pacific people who have been subdivided according to into 4 groups, according to whether they're exposed to alcohol, self-report any alcohol intake or no alcohol, and then on this axis here, whether they've got a particular genetic variant, and here's the reference group. And we can see in the no alcohol, when you compare this one here to this one here, you can see the genetic effect. So being T positive increases your risk of gout of about 2 to 3-fold. Within this genetic group, you see a slight effect of alcohol on risk, 2.7 to 3. But what's critical here is that when you combine this genetic group with alcohol exposure, you're overriding the protective effect of this genotype. Compare here to here, it's protective. It's got a higher odds ratio for gout than the other genotype in alcohol exposure. So it's an example of an unpredicted, non-additive interaction between your environmental exposure and your genotype. And these interactions are becoming more widely accepted. They're out there, and of course in obesity, the FTO versus the FTO gene is the strongest obesity effect in obesity, but it has a very strong interaction with exercise in terms of weight loss. I think in the context of trying to get your head around, if we're after solutions here, where do we intervene? And I have to come back to Tony Blakely's brilliant analogy of 1,000 duck pecks. Let's peck obesity and diabetes to death by 1,000 duck pecks. That's what it is. Okay, so we heard that this morning from Louise Bauer about their intervention study. Here's the intervention when the intervention was taken out, and it worked, right? Here's the FTO gene. So here's a group of Amazonian children followed over a period of 5 years, and you can see that effect of the FTO gene. Children here At this particular time point, those with the risk protective variant had a BMI roughly 0.4 units lower than children with the susceptibility variant, roughly similar to the effect of the intervention. So, I mean, this genetic gene, when you look at it by itself, has a weak effect, right? But it's still an effect that you could say, how would we replicate it? Can we understand and replicate the FTO effect in the risk group up here and get it down to the effect in the protective group? Who knows? But these are sort of pathways one could follow for solutions. I'm coming up to my last slide now. But again, it's just an illustration. This would be a small duck peck, right? Whether you're using genetics or biological or medical approaches or environmental approaches, sugary tax, for example, many different approaches to the same problem. So here's a take-home slide. So how do we deal with the epidemic of obesity and comorbid conditions? Well, no matter how well public health approaches work, and let's say they in the next 50 years halve the prevalence of obesity and diabetes, there will always be people with obesity and diabetes. Therefore, genetics will contribute to medical approaches to these conditions. We're always going to need improved medical approaches. These conditions are not going to go away. But I think understanding the biological drivers and genetics contributes to this, helps you understand your opponent if you're in the public health field. What are you dealing with here? And it can help perhaps provide a focus to public health approaches. And here, this is where I would really like to see more progress by the time I finish researching, which is not too far away, actually, time's going real quick. But to get more of a fusion between biomedical science and public health science. We really need to work together a lot more than we have in the past. And destigmatisation is important, and it's certainly been an important part of genetics in understanding gout. If you destigmatise, then you take away, and particularly in a political setting, governments also listen to what their population thinks about the causes of obesity, and if the population generally thinks it's all about poor behaviour, people eating too much, being bad or whatever, then that's not going to help a political environment to help get these important public health policy initiatives in and enacted. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Tony. In the interest of attempting to finish on time, we will move on, and there will be questions for Tony during the tea break, I'm sure.